I would visit my grandpa and grandma Hirman, my dad's parents, on their farm. They were people that just didn't get along at all. But in those days, they didn't divorce. So grandpa basically lived in the barn. Grandma lived in the house. And we'd visit them separately. And he'd come in and he had his bedroom at night. He'd come in and eat meals in the house. But he was always in the barn. That's the only place I have a memory of him. Why they were so on different wavelengths, but they were both very stubborn people. I know that, and they had their ways. And that stubbornness is what I was going to mention is part of why my dad didn't want to stay on the farm, because Grandpa wanted to farm with horses. And mechanical engines were starting to be around, tractors and power-driven equipment, but Grandpa was familiar with his horses, and he was going to keep his horses and farm with horses. And so that was part of what maybe disenchanted my dad from staying on the farm, and he just wasn't enchanted with being a laborer. The oldest son always got the heavy duty, they picked corn by hand and threw it against the bang board in the farm wagon to bale the shucks, hand-side the wheat, and I mean it was I think they had a 60 or 80 acre farm. It wasn't a very big farm in today's standards, but it was a lot of work. And that farm was very hilly, and there was a lot of ponds and sloughs on the farm, and we used to have a lot of fun going out exploring in the ponds and sloughs and picking up the big old bullfrogs and having fun out in that farm. But it was near a lake called Diamond Lake. And my dad used to walk over and swim in Diamond Lake. There was a public beach there, and he just loved to be in the water. My mother and my grandma Hirman, whose name was Matilda, just didn't get along, and they never got along from the time that prior, from their dating days on. Again, Grandma was a stubborn woman, and things were going to be done her way, and she was a German, and things were going to be done her way or no way, I guess. So my mother had her way she grew up with, and they just couldn't get along very well together. So often when we'd visit my grandpa and grandma Herman's farm, Dad and I would be going out there alone. See Grandma Herman. In his state of living separately and together, he just ended up getting depressed, and he eventually committed suicide in, I believe, 1946. And he shot himself out in the barn with a shotgun. My dad couldn't accept it, and he thought it was an accident. And to this day, he would insist that it was an accident. He said that gun had a hair trigger and blah, 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 but all the evidence was he had the gun rigged up and he fired it with his toe, and it was no accident. The memory I have of him is out in the barn, and I've got a picture of him holding me as a boy, and he always had a straw hat on his head and a cigarette in his mouth, and I have not a lot of memory of him because I was only 10 years old when he died, and my sister and I weren't allowed to go to the funeral. My dad and Mom went without us. Never really explained, but through other relatives and so forth, it was obvious that it was such a shame, a disgrace, that a family member would commit suicide. There was no way of dealing with it. It was just, it was just a sore that was left there. And my dad felt so terrible, and Grandma stayed on the farm for a couple of years, but she couldn't manage it. She rented out the land, and then so she moved to town into Atwater. And then I would visit her much more when she lived in town in the years that I was growing up. And I have one memory of going to her house to stay overnight, and I had a cold or didn't feel good. And she had her homemade liniment, as she called it. And she made this out of roots and this and that, and fermented it down in the basement. And it was I'm sure, about 100 proof alcohol, the way they made it in those days. So she poured me a glass of that liniment, and she put a raw egg in it, and she made me drink it. And that was something that was the most horrible thing I ever had to drink in my life. But I wasn't sick anymore.